our series on Appalling Twistianity. I want to continue to buttress the claims that I make against the Christian New Testament with citations from Yahweh's Torah and prophets, as well as from David's Mizmor. I think that the best way to expose and condemn all that is wrong about the Christian New Testament is to compare it to what God actually said. And the more you know about what Yahweh, who's God's one and only name, conveyed to us, what he inspired his prophets to write, the less you will trust the Christian New Testament, because, well, the message is the opposite of one another. So in this particular case, we were considering something that Paul pilfered to create the false impression that God supported his gospel when the actual message said exactly the opposite. Let's pick up where we were in our last program. The Torah reads, all of the terms and conditions which beneficially I have instructed, this would be Moshe speaking to us on behalf of Yahweh, this day, all of the terms and conditions that I have beneficially instructed you this day are for you to genuinely choose to observe, for you to want to closely examine and carefully consider, electing to consistently and literally focus upon, for the purpose of approaching, by actually responding and engaging, through acting upon and profiting from, even celebrating what you learn, so that you elect to continually live. Of your own free will, you choose to capitalize on the opportunity to be restored, your life preserved. In addition, you can choose to be great, actually increasing every possible aspect of your nature, so that you will be pleased when you arrive, and also so that you will become an heir within the realm which beneficially Yahweh has promised in a sworn oath to your fathers. Also, you should choose to remember, particularly the most memorable of men, everything associated with the beneficial way to the relationship, to get the most out of life, that Yahweh, your God, walked with you these 40 years in the wilderness. This is in order for you to respond, to approach by exerting yourself through the process of learning, so that you understand, coming to know and become known, yada, regarding the benefits of the relationship, deciding in your heart and in your best judgment, such that you will consistently and genuinely observe, closely examining and carefully considering the terms and conditions of his agreement. That was Dabarim, words, Deuteronomy 8:2. The statement that was cited, that we referenced, is really important because it tells us just how important the Torah is to our continued existence. God says it's the very essence of our lives, and it's the only way to approach God and to live with him in the promised land, which would be Shamayim. Well, now, so since the goal is to learn as much from God as possible so that we're in a position to properly evaluate how the Christian New Testament is the antithesis of what God has instructed us to not only observe but respond to, before we thumb ahead and Paul's despicable characterization of his but I. Paul say, let's stay a bit longer here and consider what else we can learn. This is what Moshe continued to say. Your clothing did not wear out, and nor did the footing that shoes, sandals that we provided for your feet. And your feet didn't swell either, even over these 40 years that you have been walking. Also that you would know, recognize, and acknowledge by exercising good judgment that indeed in the manner which beneficially a man instructs and corrects his children, Yahweh your God teaches and he admonishes you, providing guidance regarding that which is potentially harmful while revealing the consequences of everything he instructs. The body and words, Deuteronomy 8, 4, and 5. Here God is presenting himself in his favorite role as a father. And Moshe is saying, just like a father takes care of his children, Yahweh took care of you here so that you might have an appreciation for the kind of relationship and the role that God plays in our lives. Now, that was a summation of the Torah's purpose. It is our Heavenly Father's advice to his children. It consists of the same kind of instruction we as parents ought to be giving our sons and daughters. The Torah, therefore, not only provides us with reliable guidance, it exposes that which is potentially harmful, revealing the consequences of ignoring our Heavenly Father's advice. Since the very first time that Gospel Jesus is cited, even recognizing the quotation was errantly translated and miscast, it still directs us to the proper place in Yahweh's Torah. So let's take an additional step in Yahweh's direction. And the passage we were referencing was really a citation from Dode that was recorded by the Ebionites that where Dode actually would have said, it is not by bread alone that one lives, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And we then turn to the Torah, the very passage that Dode, who was then miscast as Jesus, cited. So as we continue, and so you should genuinely choose of your own volition to thoroughly and completely observe Shamar, Yahweh's. This is Yahweh's name as an accurate presentation of how it should be pronounced based upon Eloah, God, through his Torah instructions regarding his Haya existence. And Yahweh is providing, as the Almighty's, your provision so that you can approach by walking in his ways and for the purpose of revering and respecting him. Devarim 8:6. Now, these would be Yahweh's provisions, not, of course, Paul's. And certainly not Jesus, because Paul created the myth of Jesus. They are stipulations rather than leaps of faith. Collectively, they enable us to approach God and to enjoy his company. And these terms and conditions regarding the covenant are presented in Yahweh's Torah, a document we are encouraged to examine and consider so that we can benefit from God's instructions. Now, in short order, we're going to return to this encounter between the Torah's defender, Moshe, and Hasatan. Our purpose will be to demonstrate the strategy the adversary typically deploys so that we're attuned to his preferred tactic as we make our way through the corpus of Paul's letters, and especially Galatians, the Magna Carta of Christianity. And secondarily, by considering the Torah defender's response, and that would be Dode, who was then miscast as Jesus, we will learn how we should react to similar deceptions. But for now, let's rejoin the chronology presented by the Ebonim. The Ebonim are individuals that are referenced throughout the Torah and prophets, extraordinary people that made a conscious decision to write down in Hebrew what Dowd, as the actual Messiah and Son of God, said during the time that he was here prior to his crucifixion as the Passover lamb. Their narrative was then translated into Greek and incorporated into what's called the Gospel of Matthew. It's the only part of the Christian New Testament that has any validity, and it was just plagiarized from the Ebonim. Anyway, the Ebonim, which was then pilfered by pseudo Matthew, and the very next time we hear the Messiah speak, it is in the 5th chapter of the same book. This time, rather than negating Satan's influence by debating a singular fallen spirit, the Son of God, Dowd, sets the stage by providing the proper perspective from which to evaluate everything he would accomplish over the course of 3 years. This speech to the multitudes is errantly known as the Sermon on the Mount by those who are unaware that Solomon is the one who actually presented the Sermon on the Mount when he introduced the Nakri 1,000 years earlier during the commencement celebration for the home of Yahweh's name, also known as the First Temple. Nonetheless, to the extent that Dowd conveyed this message, that it was accurately reported by the Ebonim and then properly translated by pseudo Matthew, it is a tribute to Yahweh and his Torah. The presentation is especially germane considering Paul's claim to have been authorized by Gospel Jesus to assault and annul the Torah. Therefore, to further demonstrate that this alleged mandate is not only impossible, but in direct conflict with Gospel Jesus, let's examine more of what the Ebonim recorded. Now, keep in mind here, while Jesus never existed, he is nothing but a myth. And he's modeled after Dowd David. Dowd David is actually the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the former and returning king. And during his second of 3 lives, right on the day that he said he would arrive, 700 years in advance, he was crucified on Passover, exactly as he explained 1,000 years earlier in the 22nd Mizmor. So Dowd is the basis of the myth that was concocted around this misnomer named Jesus. Now, not everything about Jesus is based on Dowd, just all of the good stuff, the notion of resurrection and of an annual death, Easter, all of that sort of thing. That was based on Dionysus. So it is important to know that there are aspects of what we read that were actually based on the actual Messiah and Son of God fulfilling Pesach and of talking about what he would accomplish by walking out of the pages of the Torah. And in this regard, it is the Ebonim. They're called Ebonites in the English transliteration, but Ebonim is the Hebrew name for them. They were very astute at recording in Hebrew what was actually said. And it is absolutely appropriate to use the Christian New Testament's presentation of this Sermon on the Mount to demonstrate that Paul is wrong. If Paul says that the Torah has been annulled, if Paul says, which he does, that the Torah is a curse, which he does, if Paul says that if you try to follow the Torah, then you are condemned by the Torah, which he does, and the person that is attributed to this narrative that is attributed to Gospel Jesus says exactly the opposite, then Paul lied. Simple enough. You can use the Christian New Testament to disprove the Christian New Testament because it's at odds with itself. Everything in the so-called Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is caustic to the Christian religion and to Paul's diatribe, which is just amazing that Matthew was foolish enough to include the Ebonite text. And if you're concerned, say, wait a minute, how do you know it's the Ebonite text? Because there is nothing in the book of Matthew that is original. It was written in 95 CE, 60 years, 3 generations after these events played out, by an impostor, and 80% of it was plagiarized from Mark and from Luke, and the 20% that wasn't stolen from Mark and from Luke was stolen from the Ebonites. So translated from Hebrew to Greek and then to English, Dode may well have said, "You should not think or assume, you should not consider, expect, suppose at any time, even the possibility of the commonly held or popularly established presumption, and never accepting the prevailing precept or justification, that I actually came to tear down, invalidate, put an end to, or discard, to dissolve, destroy, disunite, subvert, overthrow, abrogate, weaken, dismantle, or abolish the Torah, or the prophets. I actually came not to dismiss or invalidate, to discard, but instead to completely fulfill, to proclaim and complete, conveying the true meaning and thinking, to liberally supply, carry out, and accomplish, rendering it totally and perfectly." 5:17 of Matthew. This statement alone is just Christianity. I mean, it's Paul's letters, both Romans and Galatians, assault the Torah. Say that the Torah is an evil curse and that Jesus came to annul the Torah, to do away with it, to get rid of that terrible curse. And that the Torah condemns, it does not save, and that the Torah has to be replaced, but but I, Paul, say. And yet here is the character that's attributed to gospel Jesus, and he says exactly the opposite. Based upon what is said in Matthew 5:17, Christianity is a no-go. It's impossible. You just might as well toss it away. The very fact that in the Christian New Testament is absolute proof that the Christian New Testament is false ought to have been enough for any thinking individual not consumed by faith to throw it away. Let me read that again, and then we'll go on to the next statement. It begins, "You should not think or assume that I actually came to tear down, invalidate, put an end to, or discard the Torah or the prophets. I actually came not to invalidate or discard, but instead to completely fulfill, to proclaim and complete, conveying the true meaning and thinking, to liberally supply, carry out, and accomplish it and render it totally and perfectly. Because indeed and in truth, I say to you with absolute certainty, the heaven and the earth will cease to exist, not under any circumstances shall one aspect of the smallest letter, nor the single stroke of the pen, cease to be relevant from the Torah, until with absolute certainty everything takes place. Matthew 5:18. That is as emphatic a goodbye Christianity as you could possibly have. Last time I checked, the heavens and the earth are still here. What does that mean? The Torah is still in effect, and you can't change one iota of it. And Paul discarded the entire thing and replaced it with his gospel of grace and faith in what but I, Paul, will say, and the myth of Jesus. It's devastating, because indeed and in truth, I say to you, until with absolute certainty the heaven and the earth cease to exist, not ever under any circumstances shall one tiny aspect, even the smallest letter, nor the stroke of the pen, cease to be relevant, be ignored or neglected from the Torah, until with absolute certainty everything takes place. Yahweh's name, that's ignored in Christianity, isn't it, in the New Testament? Pesach, Matzah, Bakurim, Shabuah, Towrah, Kippurim, and Sukkah, the 7 steps along the path from our world to God's, totally ignored. Terms and conditions of the covenant, never discussed. The chosen people are Yehudim, the Israelites. Sorry. Goodbye, Christianity. Therefore, whoever may at any time dismiss or attempt to do away with one of the smallest and least important of these prescriptions and instructions, which are enjoined, and he instructs or indoctrinates people in this manner, he will actually be provided the name and will be judiciously and legally summoned as lowly and little. That's inside, but you got to know, you got to be able to think it through. And the person actually delivering these words to condemn Christianity was Dod, the actual Messiah and Son of God. And what he knew is that Shaul, a name that means question him, Shaul, the person that Yahweh said 666 years to the time that Paul would write his first letter in 66 and 52 CE, that Shaul was the plague of death. Well, he knew that Shaul would change his name to Paulos, a Roman name. And guess what Paulos means? Lowly and little. That's pretty devastating by the kingdom of heaven. Let's read through that again, because that's really insightful. I mean, this proves my point that David, as the prophet, the psalmist, the king, the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who actually fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakurim, and who spoke these words, was brilliant. Therefore, whoever at any time dismisses or attempts to do away with one of the smallest and least important of these prescriptions and instructions, which are enjoined, and he instructs or indoctrinates people in this manner, he will actually be provided the name and will judiciously and legally be summoned as lowly and little by the kingdom of heaven. Ouch. Paul negated all of it. He even went as far as to say that if you're circumcised, you can't be saved by his Christ. And yet circumcision is not only the fifth and final condition of the covenant, but it's the sign of the covenant. This nails Paul to the wall. That's who it was spoken against. And then whosoever might act upon it, may engage through the Torah, making the most of it, attempting to carry it out as the assigned tasks are presented, and teach it to try to provide and share the Torah's instructions expounding on it, he will be properly referred to and named great and important among those who reign within the heavens. Thank you, King Dode, because that is what we're doing. And it's nice to know that we have your attention and that by teaching Torah, by sharing Yahweh's instructions through the Torah, and in following your example, where you, Dode, wrote the 119th Mizmor to explain everything there is to know in jot and tittle order, presenting your presentation in Hebrew alphabetical order through the 22 letters of the Hebrew language with 8 statements devoted to each letter in alphabetical order on how to observe the Torah in the 109th Mizmor. You set the example that we have striven to follow. And it is now unequivocal that to teach the Torah is to be considered great in heaven, and to annul the Torah is to be considered lowly and little Paulos. Kiss your Christianity goodbye. Now that was unequivocal, and it's correct. So it's quite possible that Dode conveyed this message. In fact, likely. The content was also complete, and it was in total opposition to the Christian New Testament and all of the but I Paul that Paulos contrived to discount or discard any aspect of the Torah, and Paul trashed it. An individual such as Paulos has to contradict Dode's declaration as it was transferred to the lips of pretend Jesus. It would be irrational for anyone to claim to have been granted authorization to speak on behalf of an individual when his message is contradictory to his own. If you are rational and informed, and you just check out what I have just read that's attributed to Gospel Jesus in the 5th chapter of Matthew, and you compare that to Paul's assault on the Torah in Galatians and in Romans, it's just over. There's nothing left. Christianity is dead. Toss away the myth of Jesus. No such person existed. Now, if the Messiah's message is accurately recorded and then translated and maintained, the notion of a New Testament is torn asunder because Yahweh's original testimony is still valid. And based upon this statement, Paul's letters, which speak the opposite message, which seek to invalidate the Torah, must be discarded. But it's as devastating to the Christian New Testament even the other way. If Gospel Jesus cannot be trusted, then neither can Paul, because he would be speaking on behalf of a liar. In fact, if the words attributed to Gospel Jesus cannot be trusted, then the whole New Testament has to be rejected because it claims to chronicle his words and deeds. The realization that there was no such individual, at least by that name, does not ease the burden of the religion, but only exacerbates it. Yes, it is appropriate to use the myth to destroy the mythology, because it does. And there's no way out of this conundrum for Christians. This is an unanswerable enigma. It cannot be resolved. Right here, if I was dealing with an informed and rational audience, they would recognize that you can just toss away, throw away, not only the Christian New Testament, but the entire myth that there was a Jesus Christ. That any of it is worth anything, that it isn't all just a pile of lies. Well, except the testimony that the Ebonim recorded from the Sermon on the Mount as well as from the Olivet Discourse. After all, the myth of Jesus wasn't concocted out of thin air. It was based upon the second life of three of the actual Messiah, Son of God, and former and returning king who fulfilled Passover, crucified by the Romans. Exactly when and how and where he said it would occur. Now, neither option is acceptable if you're religious. With regard to the religion's veracity, it actually does not matter if this statement was from Dode or Gospel Jesus, because it remains the most famous and well-attended public pronouncement found anywhere in the Greek text. If the Messiah's uncompromising declaration before the largest audience he would ever address during this, the second of three lives, the speech originally chronicled by Jews in Hebrew, if it isn't reliably conveyed, then nothing in the Greek manuscripts can claim to be accurate or credible. And if Dode's sentiments were accurately recast through Gospel Jesus, properly translated into Greek and then responsibly retained, there is no possibility that the Christian religion is valid, because it is in complete and irreconcilable conflict with the letters which comprise the words of the Torah. If as a Christian you cannot, or you just know if, as a Christian you can't discount this without tossing away the New Testament, throwing it in the trash. And the moment that is done, everything is properly seen as rhetorical rubbish. But on the other hand, to believe the man who shared these words, you would have to reject the religion errantly ascribed to him. Now, equally telling, especially since the prophets were included in this affirmation, the majority of Yahweh's prophecies, including his return with his son and his ultimate renewal and restoration of the covenant with Yisrael and Yehudah, have not yet occurred. And the heavens and the earth remain. Therefore, the Torah stands. And that is something for the religious to think about, especially considering the subject and the speaker. Therefore, after reading this, since you can no longer pretend to be ignorant of this proclamation, your only options are to reject Christianity or remain irrational. And what do you suppose the merits might be of believing in something which is not logical? Since we are now aware of the speaker's assessment of those who attempt to dismiss and discard any portion of the Torah, and that he referred to such attempts as polos, lowly and little, there is no longer any avenue through which to view Paulus' attempts to demean and to value the Torah favorably. In this light, how is it that Paul convinced the world that God had authorized him to do precisely what the Messiah just testified should not and could not be done? Said another way, there is no chance whatsoever that God inspired, even condoned or endorsed the writings of a man who invalidated his Torah in terms, particularly in view of this statement and of thousands of others like it. Do Christians honestly believe that Paul can constantly contradict God and still be trusted? Are you out of your minds? Now, I realize that we have just begun our investigation, and that apart from the 4 derogatory statements that we have thus far considered, where Paulos referred to the Torah as a curse, something abhorrent, repugnant, and malicious, and where he claimed that absolutely no one could be saved by the Torah, I have not yet validated the assertion that Paul claimed to have destroyed and discarded the Torah after dissolving and dismantling it. Therefore, while we will cover all of this in great detail, until then, here is a literal rendering of Paul's most poisonous proposition. With so much at stake, readability will suffer here in favor of accuracy. This is literal. Paul positioned, having come to realize, without investigation or evidence, that by no means whatsoever is made righteous or vindicated man out of acting upon the Torah, if not by faith in iousu Christou. And we to Christon iousun ourselves believed in order for us to be acquitted out of faith in Christou, and not out of acting upon the Torah. Because out of the works of the Torah, not any flesh will be acquitted, vindicated, or made righteous. Galatians 2:16. Because if that which I have actually torn down, that I have dissolved and dismantled, that I have invalidated and abolished, that I have negated, abrogated, and discarded, that I have completely destroyed, by this, on the other hand, I strengthen and promote this edifice which I myself bring into existence and have recommended. 2:18. I then, because of the Torah, actually died and was separated in order that to God I might currently live in Christo. I have actually been crucified together with. Oh, ignorant and irrational, dim-witted and unreasonable Galatians, who bewitched you and deceived you? Oh, I know the answer to that one. And this alone I want to learn from you out of accomplishments of the Torah, the Spirit you received, or alternatively, out of hearing of the belief. Galatians 3:2. In this way, you are ignorant and irrational, lacking in knowledge and unable to think logically, having begun with spirit and now in flesh you are completing. 3:3. So much and so long these things you suffered. You were afflicted, and now you are vexed and annoyed without result or a plan. If indeed also thoughtlessly and for nothing, without reason or cause. 3:4. The one, therefore then, supplying you the Spirit and causing to function and operating powers in you out of acting upon and engaging in the tasks delineated in the Torah, or out of hearing faith. Indeed, consequently, the Torah accordingly is against and contrary to the promise of the God. Not may it be, it might be, although I don't want it to be, for if, perchance, had been given the Torah the power and ability, the capacity and resources to impart life, certainly in the Torah would be the righteousness and vindication. 3:21. To the contrary, emphatically and certainly, written scripture imposed restrictions, completely shutting the door on heaven, imprisoning everything under error and being evil, in order that the promise out of the faith of Christou, iousu Christou, might be given to the believers. 3:22. But before they to come to the faith under the control of the Torah, we were actually being held in custody as prisoners, restricted and trapped like fish in a net. To the bringing about of faith was revealed. Faith in what? Oh, you're going to discard the prophetically proven word of Yahweh, of God, and you're going to discard it all, annul it all, say it has no validity because of faith? And faith in what? In a myth? In a person who never lived? In a misnomer? In a product of identity theft? God, you got to be absolutely friggin' stupid. As a result, the Torah has come to exist as our disciplinarian, as a pedagogue which instructs in a particularly pedantic and dogmatic manner, using strict, old-fashioned methods with an overbearing demeanor by smiting and stinging those it enslaves, extending until Christone in order that by means of the faith or belief system we might at some point in time, while doing nothing ourselves, be justified with the possibility of something someday being vindicated as a result of being influenced. Galatians 3:24. But now, having come the faith-based system of belief, no longer do we exist under the old-fashioned and strict disciplinarian whose methods are antiquated and overbearing, even harsh. Yeah, just give up all of that instruction and teaching from God and discount it as overbearing and old-fashioned and an antiquated method, because all you have to do is believe. Believe who? Believe I, Paul say. But what is Paul's credibility? He has none. He's a nincompoop. This resolutely accurate and literal translation is a word-for-word presentation of the text of Galatians and how it actually reads in Greek, something that will be conclusively demonstrated in time. It sounds coarse and disjointed. It sounds idiotic, partly because it was poorly written. But if you look beyond the sorry prose and you consider the intent of the words, there is no mistaking the fact that Paul is claiming that he has invalidated and destroyed the Torah because he views God's guidance as inept and incompetent, even antiquated, mean-spirited, and overbearing. He's also claiming to have replaced the arcane and impotent Torah with his edifice, the faith of Iesu Christou, which is now wholly suspect due to the testimony of the same individual. For someone who knows and loves Yahweh, for someone who has been enriched and empowered by his Bereth covenant, as someone who has been perfected and adopted into his family through the Mikra, these invitations to be called out and meet, and for someone who has been liberated and enlightened by the brilliance of his Torah teaching, Paul's rhetoric is nauseating. Even without my affinity for Yahweh, for any rational, informed, and moral individual, Paul's claims are condescending, they're illogical, they're obnoxious. Such an illiterate and ignorant individual ought not have fooled anyone, much less billions. The fact that he has a testament, it just speaks of the fallen state of humankind. People will believe anything. Go on X. You want proof? Go to church. You want proof? Listen to a Muslim scream Allahu Akbar as they feel justified in rape and torture and abduction and murder. People will believe anything. Go and look to a conspiracy site. They're nuts. The Christian New Testament is craziness. It's pure insanity. It is one rational fallacy on top of another. Rather than being inspired by God, it contradicts God at every opportunity. And it's obvious. Now, returning to Dode's declaration, indirectly, He incriminated Shaul, a man who not only dismissed the Torah, but who also claimed to be a rabbi and a Pharisee, in addition to being a religious expert, a scholar, an orator, and a writer. Now, please consider what the actual Messiah said next. For indeed, I say to you all, that unless your righteousness, integrity, and standing in the relationship is abundantly superior and eminently more appropriate than the religious teachers, experts, scribes, and scholars, as well as the Pharisees, you will absolutely never move into nor experience the realm of the heavens. Matthew 5:20 just smacked Paul, who was a religious teacher, who was a rabbi, who claimed to be among the Pharisees. He just smacked him down again. Since we are still in the infancy of our study, notwithstanding the foregoing, for some it may seem a bit presumptuous to conclude that Paul's overall intent was to foreclose the Torah in order to promote his new faith, although I think I proved it quite nicely with the previous citing from Galatians. And yet the translations of the Galatians passages that we considered conclusively demonstrate that Christian theologians have correctly interpreted Paul's message when they cite this letter as evidence that he said that the Torah was outdated and restrictive, that it was a burden that had to be replaced with a much simpler and accommodating approach. But why is it that not one Christian scholar has the character, the courage, the intellect, the integrity to admit that Paul's proposition is diametrically opposed to the Messiah and even to that of gospel Jesus, especially pursuant to the Torah? Since Paul isn't coy about it, why not just come out and admit that Paul's positions are in direct conflict with the Word of God? Because they are. Don't carry around the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, and the writings and pretend that that's God somehow had some influence on that crap that you believe in the Christian New Testament. They are the antithesis of one another. Now, speaking to those who are willing to invest the time required to actually know YAHOWAH, to those who seek to learn the truth, to those willing to engage in the process that leads to admission into God's home, Dowd, as the actual Messiah, provided a set of instructions which completely undermine the ignorance of blind faith. You should ask, at the present time, it is desirable for everyone to act upon his own initiative, to earnestly request information, knowledge, and answers, and it will be given. In the future, this will reliably produce the desired results for you. You should seek. At the present time, it is desirable for everyone to act on his own initiative and attempt to find the information, searching for knowledge and answers, and you will actually receive that discovery. You should knock, and it will be opened to you. Matthew 7:7. This, by the way, is really apropos to Dowd and has nothing to do with pretend Jesus. Why? Because Dowd fulfilled Passover. What is Passover? It is the doorway to life, the doorway to God's home. It is Dowd, David, the actual Messiah, who fulfilled Passover, that opened that door. He's the one telling you that it'll be opened if you're observant, if you pay attention to what he's telling you. there's no door for gospel Jesus. For then, universally, the one asking receives, and the one seeking actually finds, and one knocking, for him it will be opened. Matthew 7:8. The Messiah's declaration is consistent with Yahowah's Torah guidance. God consistently encourages us to be actively observant, which is to closely examine and carefully consider his instructions, especially the provisions associated with the covenant. He asks us to listen to his prescriptions for living so that we can act upon what we discover. This, however, is the antithesis of Paul's proposition, which is salvation through passive faith. God's methods requires us to seek, to learn, then accept and engage. Seek, learn, accept, engage. But with faith, both the process and the response are unnecessary, even counterproductive. This makes faith a cop-out, an excuse to forgo investigation and contemplation. Faith is what is needed when you do not know. Those who believe do not understand. Well, Dode's next statement is also hostile to Paul's proposition because he is directing our attention not to himself, but instead to Yahowah, to our Heavenly Father, and to the Father's gift, which is found in the Torah. But beyond this, the juxtaposing of these thoughts, Dode is also revealing where we should look to find the door to seek acceptance. He is even contrasting the merits of Yahowah's testimony, his offer and promises, against the statements and assurances of a man. He is saying this expecting that we will act upon Yahowah's offer instead of the one promoted by someone who was clearly as disingenuous as Paul. And as you have already noted, I have concluded that the Ebonim correctly recorded Dode's proclamation because it is too accurate and in complete conflict with Christianity. And therefore, it could not have been spoken by anyone less than the true Messiah and the Son of God. In fact, the Jesus myth was initially based upon what Dode said, what he achieved, upon his titles and his accolades. His name was changed, as was his God's, and then his accomplishments and titles were stolen, buried under a mountain of religious replacements. The actual Messiah said, "Should you be considering an alternative? What man currently exists from among you who, when his son asks you for a loaf of bread, will give him a stone?" Well, this is telling too. The alternative to the Word of God, to the Torah and the prophets, is what Paul say, man's gibberish, or Akibas, or Muhammad's. And so the bread that Dode is speaking of after having spoken of Passover is matzah. It's the unyeasted bread that removes the fungus of religion from our lives, the guilt of religion from our lives, from our souls. And so that is the bread that is being addressed here. But the stone, well, in Christianity, it would be Pope Peter. Saint Peter. Peter is the one that the Christian church would tell you became the rock, the stone. And then it goes even into Christianity, where the stone is the black stone of Allah, and to Islam, I should have said. Because in Islam, the black stone is Allah. So it's the black stone of Islam, and it is the rock upon which the myth of the Christian church and of a Christ is built. And here, Dode, the actual cornerstone of the very covenant family of God, told you that this man, when you ask him for bread, is going to give you a stone. Wow, is that astute? It's almost humbling sometimes when we consider what Dode was able to deliver. Now, at this point, we have to recognize two things. Having read all of Dode's Mizmor Psalms, that Dode was the most brilliant and articulate man who ever lived. And he was a prophet with the Spirit of Yahweh within him, and therefore he was particularly insightful. Now, in this case, he has spent 1,000 years in Shamaim, in heaven with Yahweh. And so he's coming back down to earth after having the benefit of serving as a prophet and the Son of God and the Messiah and King collectively for 70 years in his first life. Now he's had 1,000 years with Yahweh in Shamaim. So, he ought to be on his game. This is the kind of brilliance you would expect. But the very thing of him fulfilling matzah and carrying away religious guilt after fulfilling Passover and opening the doorway to life. And he speaks of this doorway, and then he speaks of the bread that is the symbol of the yeast being removed so that we appear perfect. And he compares that to a man offering a stone. And then you have the entire mythos of Christianity based upon that bogus statement, upon this rock I will build my church, because imaginary Peter claimed that he was the Christ. And then from this, not a number of centuries thereafter, you would have the rock of stone of Allah haunting God's people. It was, and that's, I admire brilliance, and that's brilliance, folks. Or should you be considering as an alternative reason also interesting, because when Moshe delivered the Torah, the alternative to Moshe was Aaron. And Aaron was always the one out being religious and being stupid. So Aaron is the alternative to the Torah. So by even using this concept of alternative, it's a very interesting play on words. So should you be considering an alternative? When he asks for a fish, we'll hand him a snake. Oh, yeah. Again, brilliant. What is the theme of the Christian mythos about the disciples? Now, the disciples are all imaginary characters, as was Jesus. But what's the mythos? That he called them to be fishers of men. So this is the fish. What does the Pope wear? That tall pointed hat? It's the hat of Dagon. It is a fish hat. The symbol of Christianity was a sideways version of Asherah. Asherah was the mother of God and the queen of heaven, and so her symbol was, I'm sorry to be graphic, but it was a vagina. And so Christians, because of the incorporation of the mother of God and queen of heaven into the religion through the misappropriation of Mary, came up with a sideways version of that, where one person would draw the bottom part, the other person would draw the top part, and they turned what was the womb, the entrance to the womb of Asherah, the mother of God, queen of heaven, and the Babylonian religion, into the fish, or the ichthus of Christianity. And the snake, of course, well, the snake is the very demon, Hasatan, who went into the garden to mislead Chawah and Adam in this very way, and the very individual who Paul admits possessed him. because Paul was demon-possessed by a demon of Hasatan, which he admits in the second letter to the Corinthians. And it was also Muhammad who admitted multiple times that he was possessed. And so this is the snake that represents Satan. Wow. Okay, now the reason that this is a wow for me, and I have to take a breath every once in a while here, is that Yahweh has asked me to serve as Dod's herald, which means that I am his one who speaks for him. I'm one who announces his arrival, if you will, and one who is going to be serving Dode as the lesser luminary going forward. And the very realization that I'm going to be representing a guy that's this brilliant, that's humbling, because this is really, really brilliant. If you know the whole story and you're familiar with all of the lies and the mythos that was used to create Christianity and Islam, then Dode's refutation of them, he's really on his game. This is sharp. So if, therefore, you all presently and actively being troublesome and morally corrupt have in the past been familiar with and have actually known how to give a good and beneficial gift to your children, how much more in contrast will your Father, the one in the heavens, actually give something good, moral, generous, and beneficial to those asking this of him? Well, this also notes that there's only one person in all of human history that can actually refer to Yahweh as Father, because Yahweh said of his son Dode 3 times, "You are my son, I am your father." And Yahweh specifically referred to Dode as my Bekor, my firstborn son. And so Dode knows that Yahweh is Chanan. He is merciful. He is good. He is fortuitous. He is generous. He is loving. He is compassionate. He is all of these things. And he knows that when we respect Yahweh, when we approach Yahweh, and by closely examining and carefully considering his testimony, that our Father in the heavens will actually give exactly what it is that his children need. And that is the opposite of Christianity. You know, Christianity, it's not a father that was in heaven. No, their God is the Son, the man God on earth. Beyond that, their God is a Lord. Lords aren't fathers. Lords are mean. They're controlling. They're obnoxious. They own. Dode knows better. He's referring to Yahweh as your Father in heaven. Very different than Christianity. And who is the one that is giving these gifts? Well, he's speaking of the Torah and the Father who is presented in the Torah. We actually read the passage in the Torah where it spoke about the Father providing for the children of Israel, didn't we? The Father is Yahweh, who authored the Torah, upon which the gift of life is provided, that which is moral, beneficial to us. Now, therefore, since Apollos is offering an incredulous promise via faith in his irrational claims, and Yahweh is offering the gift of the covenant, which offer do you suppose might be more beneficial and credible, more generous and substantial? And since this follows a presentation on asking and seeking, Do you suspect that the Messiah is indicating where we ought to look for something which is reliable, good, valuable, and kind? He just finished directing our attention to the Torah and prophets. Further, since the answers to these questions are so obvious, why do Christians who claim that their religion is based upon gospel Jesus ignore all of this and turn to Paul instead? In light of this, how did Shaul manage to convince them that the Torah was something that was not good, anything but generous, capable, or beneficial? Well, the Messiah concluded, anything, therefore, to whatever, to the degree or extent, you might want or may enjoy, as a result, men being human, doing for yourself, also in this way, you should choose to actively do for them. This, then, actually and presently is the Torah and the prophets. Wow. Once again, he's equating good, beneficial, favorable, compassionate, loving gifts to the Torah and to the Father of the covenant. Therefore, not to a New Testament. Therefore, not to annul it. Therefore, not Paul. Anything, therefore, whatever to the degree or the extent that you might want to enjoy, that you decide or presently desire, that you propose or be of the opinion currently to think something might be so. As a result, men being human, doing for yourself, actively attempting to perpetrate this, fashioning and assigning these things with regard to yourself, also in this way, likewise in this manner, should choose to actively do. This then, actually and presently, is the Torah. Matthew 7:12. The moral here is that since we do not want a millstone or a premature burial, a poisonous snake or a serpent representing Satan given to us by men or their institutions, and would be vastly better served with Yahowah's good, generous, and beneficial gift, we ought to offer our fellow man access to God's offer, starting with our children by providing them with an accurate rendering of our Heavenly Father's Torah as he presents his Bereth covenant. Well, I thank you for listening. This has been a wonderful excursion down truth and liar's lane. Truth comes from Yahowah, and the liar is Paul. Thank you for listening. I am Craig Winn, and this has been a special edition of the Yahowah blog.